Hello, my name is Elma Witherspoon. I am the daughter of Henrietta Holder Witherspoon from Crozierville. My father is William S.V. Witherspoon. He's from Arthington. But I grew up in Crozierville with my parents. So all of my days from second grade or from the age of 7 through when I started high school, I spent in Crozierville. My mother's father came from Barbados, but I believe it was his father, Nathaniel Holder, who came with my mother's grandfather, Nathaniel Holder, and I believe her mother was Nancy. I always heard her talk about Grandma Nancy, Grandma Nancy. So Nathaniel and Nancy would have been the couple that came from Barbados to Crozierville to settle. And they had 3 sons: James Holder, who's my grandfather, Richard Holder, and Samuel Holder. My grandfather is James. I did not know him because he died before I was born, but that's who my mother lived with in Crozierville. And her mother was Selina Calker, but she was from the Mende tribe. So I understand my grandfather met her at a very young age because he was, I think, an assistant secretary of the interior. And so he traveled from county to county, mostly in the interior areas, to settle disputes. And it was during one of those travels that he met my grandmother. And the two of them had my mother, Henrietta Holder. But I know some of my aunts and uncles, but regrettably not a lot about him. That's who she lived with most of the time in Crozierville. And she also lived at some point in time with her aunt, Ella Holder, who was once married to, I think, a Bracewell, and then later on to John Isaac Alexander Weeks. But those were the two. There was the aunt that my mother lived with during her years growing up, and her father, James Holder. Growing up, my mother talked about her father, James Holder. I didn't know very much about him, but she also talked a lot about her aunt, Ella Holder, who was married to a Hill and had one daughter, Frances. Later on, she got married to John Isaac Alexander Weeks, J.I. Weeks. My mother lived with Aunt Ella, who we knew, and she always talked fondly of my Auntie Ella, and my aunt took her as a daughter because she had one daughter, Frances Hill. People told me I looked like Frances Hill because I remember her picture so well. I mean, she had this long, wavy hair. But more than that, she had eyes that looked like mine. And when my mother had me, it's like my aunt grew even more fond of her because I reminded her of her daughter who had died of cancer. And the interesting thing about cousin Frances was she was my mother's first cousin and also my father's first cousin, because my mother's cousin, my father's cousin, because my father is from Arthington, and that's where Frances Hill was from. And so her paternal family was from Arthington, but her mother's side of the family was from Crozierville. So I always heard that, cousin Frances was like a relative on both my mother's side and my father's side, but that's where they trace my eyes from, because I grew up my brothers and all insulting me with his phrase, "Look at her cat eyes," but older people loved my eyes. I got to realize that they were an asset. So cousin Frances, yes, my mother talked about her, and she was the daughter of almost like a mother to my mom, because my mother lived with Ella Holder part of the time she was growing up in Crozierville. Well, in Crozierville, I know growing up, she talked about how hard, she worked. Yeah, you know, growing up, for the girls, they taught them different things. They cleaned, they cooked, basically her mother was from the indigenous side, and her father always had. Her father was married. His wife didn't have any children, so a lot of them lived in the house there. So she always talked about working hard, cleaning, cooking, and she always talked about how that showed her what it was like to work hard and face challenges in life. So it wasn't a rosy growing up, but she appreciated it because it taught her hard work, strength, and how to face, whatever came her way. So most people, and I know she was a strict disciplinarian because she was a teacher. So I can see where all of that came from. She had that strength and perseverance to basically face any challenge in life. So her days, her youth growing up in Crozierville armed her with those qualities that made her who she was. She ended up becoming an educator and a staunch, as I said, disciplinarian. And she went to school there and she graduated with her bachelor's degree and she started teaching. So she was a teacher all her life. She then became principal. She talked about being at CDB King School. She always talked about some of the students she had there. But I knew that she was a teacher. I think when I was in the second grade, well, she came over to the United States after having all 5 of her children. She was here in the States for 1 year, and she went back home after the 1 year and became principal of the school in Crozierville. The school in Crozierville was well known too because we had kids that came from White Plains, Cairnsburg, Crozierville. They all went to this school in Crozierville. And sometimes I meet people now, they talk about their days at Crozierville and how they appreciated the education and the discipline. And they always talk about my mom, the kind of disciplinarian they were. It was so funny the other day, well, a couple of years ago, May 10th came around. And May 10th is Crozierville's birthday. And I was on Facebook, and someone made a comment. Oh, the day is Crozierville's birthday. I remember we used to celebrate it, dressed up in our uniforms and all. And somebody else came and put a comment there. Yes, and I remember teacher Henrietta, and how she used to discipline us and beat us in school and gave us that discipline. And I smiled, and I added my comment. I said yes, and think about living with her 24/7. But you know what? I remember my brother was preaching her funeral, and he said, she disciplined us. She didn't spare the rod. And mommy, today we thank you that you didn't spare the rod because you are responsible for who we are today. That is so true. She disciplined us. She taught us right from wrong. And I think that is part of what has made many of us successful today. I think of my mom, being a disciplinarian and an educator. One of the things that come to mind about what she used to tell us, for me, it stuck to me, it stuck in the back of my mind to the point where I had it printed on a souvenir that we gave during her funeral. It was a fan, and I left some of the fans at the church we went to, Reese Memorial. It had her picture at the front, and at the back of it, we mentioned, in her memory, we leave you with one of her favorite quotes. And the title of this quote is To Know or Not to Know. And it was written by Born Nodal. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right. But he always used to say, she always told us, he who knows not and knows not that he knows not is a fool. Shun him. He who knows not and knows that he knows not is ignorant. Teach him. He who knows and knows that he knows I have to rephrase that. He who knows and knows not that he knows is asleep. Awaken him. He who knows and knows that he knows is wise. Follow him. He who knows not, yet will not learn nor follow, is dangerous. Beware. So that stuck with us, and many people who went to that school, the Internet Tutman Community School, where she was principal, and were there for, several years, remember her quote. She always used to tell us, he who knows not and knows not that he knows not is a fool. Shut him. But he who knows and knows that he knows is wise, follow him. I don't know where she got that from, but that left such an imprint on my mind. And many of us who were students at that school, I felt it was, the right thing to do, to memorialize her with this fan and the poem that's on the back of the book, the fan. That she always stood up for what she felt was right. To the point where, being a child growing up, I always used to see family members, some younger than her, but older than me, they would always come to her. And even straight, people she knew in Crozierville. It was like she was the mouthpiece, or whoever it was that would speak out for those people who felt they didn't have a voice. And she always tried to be honest and to do the right thing. So that I remember about her. People used to, I don't speak Pele, but my husband speaks it, and he talk about, and a cousin of mine always used to say she's a rock. For her, if you fall on her, you would get hurt. If she falls on you, she would get hurt. Regardless of what it was just she was like this strong, disciplinary, straight talking, honest person people felt comfortable with, to really come and talk to her and ask her for help when they felt there was no way out. Even if it meant just going to plead a case or to talk to someone else about what they needed. So that I remember of her growing up. Well, I remember her being Mother of the Year at the church and other churches. I know I have a picture here on my wall where we went to a church in Marshall when they made her Mother of the Year. And this is when we were all grown. I remember I was married. I had my first daughter. So my then husband was there. My brother, I had, there were 3 of us were married already, were there with our spouses, and 2 of us weren't, 2 of her kids weren't. But we were all there with my first child, and my brother had his first child. So it was like 3 generations at that program, which was honored as Mother of the Year. But again, there were honors at the church too, because at the church in Crozierville, yes, it was always a Mother's Day celebration. We honor one of the, honor women in the church. And she had that honor also. But those were the ones I remembered growing up, and that come to mind. Growing up, there was really nothing really funny. I remember just seriousness. I was, me and my daughter was talking about it, and she was like, yeah, I don't know anything funny about you, mommy, because you always, your face was always so straight and stern. So for me, I don't remember anything funny about you. So, that's how it is about my mom too. I don't remember anything fun, but growing up for me in Crozierville really it reminds me of when life was simple. You're out there running around with nothing to worry or care about, running up and down the streets of Crozierville, and we're going, if we went on an errand or we're going someplace that would take us all the way up to where just live. I remember, we were so free running, but as you reach to the homes of people who knew your parents, you will stop running like Aunt Ella, I'm running, we're acting crazy and wild on the road, frisky on the streets, and we'll get to, and we were approaching Aunt Ella's house, we'll stop and just start walking slowly as though we're such, and as soon as we pass the house, and it gets, we know that Aunt Ella can no longer see us, we start running and doing crazy. So growing up, those are some of the fun things you remember, being in school, you know, up and down the streets. I mean, we work hard and all, but there are times we play. And it was just the simplicity of life, the things you did, growing your gardens and eating your, you know, food from your garden. Now, I remember once it was like my mother ordered me that morning. We had all planted gardens in the back of the house. And this day she went out and dug up the cassava from my garden. And that cassava was so huge. And we had it for breakfast that Sunday morning. And I couldn't believe it was my little garden, you know. Oh, Elma, look at what I dug up for your garden. So we have cassava and gravy this Sunday morning for breakfast before we go to church. So those are the little things in life, the simple things and the little things that we at the time we ignore. We can look back at all now and say, yeah, you know, life was great. We didn't have a lot, but we had, you know, we're satisfied and a lot to be grateful for, really. I have to say, discipline and hard work. You know, sometimes I tell my children today, listen, most times when I'm asking you to do something for me, it's not that I can do it for myself. Because everything that I ask you to do, trust me, I can do it on my own. I may be a little too tired to do it. And I'm asking you to help me out, but don't ever think that I can't do it myself. So my mother taught me hard work. I was the only daughter she had, but I wasn't spoiled. She never spared the rod with us because she felt if you spare the rod, you spoil the child. So we used to be examples, even in school. If anything goes wrong, we used to be the first to get beat. And once she beats her, you know, she's beating everybody else. And me being the only daughter, I was always the first to get beat. So that was the example there. And so everybody else would have that beating. But she taught us discipline, so we always knew right from wrong. Always knew right from wrong. And I think those are some of the things that today has enabled us to be what we are, hardworking, never step down from a challenge, take care of your responsibility, being responsible, respectful. And when I say respectful, I'm not talking about kissing up to somebody or yes, sir. You know, respect others and treat others as you would have them treat you. So those were the lessons that I remember, and I think that have become a part of me and have made me who I am today. Oh, I used to love when we hosted the Sunday school convention. You had churches converge in the same place. When we celebrated United Nations Day and all of the schools came together, you know, and you would, you know, so that was when we put on our best. We'd be dressed sharp in our official uniform, we call it, because the official uniform was different from the way you went to school in every day. So everybody dressed up in white shirts, blue skirts, white socks, black shoes, would march up. And that was the time for you to, you know, do your little bluffing and crush on people, you know, boys, you see that. So all of those. So growing up, you know, those were some of the fondest memories when we would have people from other settlements nearby converge in Crozierville for any kind of celebration, be it the Flag Day, United Nations Day, the church annual conference, you name it. So those were great times. You know, Easter, I still remember one of the highlights for us as kids growing up was the beating of Judas on Fridays. I mean, somebody would beat that Judas, and we took pride in beating the Judas that crucified enemy that was responsible for pointing out Christ. So that was a great day. And, you know, Easter, we always knew of the meaning of Easter. Christmas was so different there than here. We may have, you know, we had gifts and things, but it wasn't as commercialized as what we've seen today, because Christmas was always focused on Christ. So we knew those stories, you know, the gifts were few, but the celebration was really about Christ. Another thing I noticed was Thanksgiving. You know, we usually celebrate Thanksgiving at the Episcopal Church because They showed you the real meaning of Thanksgiving when people would come with what they had grown, their crops, their chicken and different things, and they would put it on display. It was like the first fruit. You bring the best to Thanksgiving to say thank you to the Lord. It's a lot different from what we experience here in the United States, but because Thanksgiving is all about eating and drinking, so it was a little different. But I remember those things, and I remember how growing up in Crozierville, the adults try to maintain the whole meaning and significance of these celebrations for us, and quite different from what we're experiencing today. So, I talk about my Aunt Ella and the influence she had on us. We made sure that, we were walking on, we were behaving well whenever we even passed by her house. But there were other women in Crozierville too that I still remember the impact they had on my life. We had, of course, I had relatives and JERUSHA who used to go to all the time. Or when you get there, you always had something to eat and cake. I still remember her the vitality and all, and the children and grandchildren. And but one person who wasn't a relative that I remember and I talk about all the time is Rebecca Clark. We used to call her Teacher Beck. Teacher Beck wrote the best plays and stories. And I always, my husband and I went to school together in Crozierville, and we used to be two people that were always in Teacher Beck's plays, because they were the people who could speak and, smart kids who could memorize and recite all these recitations. But Teacher Beck had this skill. And I look back and say, the only thing that Teacher Beck missed, she had the platform that was available to her in Crozierville to put her talent on display. But Teacher Beck is one of those people that produced it. For me, it was a Broadway production in Crozierville. It was the equivalent of Broadway production here. The playlist. And we did how you call this singing when you sing the musicals? We did musicals too. She would write the songs. I remember this song that she wrote about the making of the flag. Said J.J. Roberts to Susanna Lewis, a flag our country needs. Now can you make one for us? To wish she did. We sport them. I can't sing, but it's like, these were things that I come over here and say, we had our own Broadway show and we were on stage producing those things, but it was a much, much smaller platform to display her talent. But she was one of Crozierville's greatest, I'm telling you. I'm not sure if there's anyone from her family that's, part of this, but Teacher Beck was a gem. The holders live out of Crozierville, I must admit. Many of them, my age group, let me put it that way, they were in Monrovia, when I was growing up. But I did have cousins, and they were my uncle's daughters that lived in the house with us. So those are the ones that grew up like, sisters. We actually slept in the same bed. I think I had a regular sized bed, but we were three in that bed at one time, and sometimes I wonder now, how could the three of us sleep? But as I said, life was simple then. And we just, we lived, we were happy, we were fed. We didn't have a lot, but we had enough. The first time I visited Crozierville after the war was in 2006. And I went there with my kids. We went up the river and I was showing them, the church. We went to the school I went to, and I looked in the auditorium, it looked so small. But then I took them to the house across the street that we grew up in. And we went into the house, people were living in there. And I was sitting there, I said, yes, I told them, I'm sorry, but I lived in this house way back. I just want to show my kids. And I showed them my room. The room looked so tiny. I couldn't understand how a bed fitted in that room. And then I had a dresser also. And then we were three that slept in the bed. But we grew up, it's like we grew up like one big family, cousins and all grew up together. My cousins, you know, I still, when I go to Liberia, I still see some of them. You know, I always, you know, whenever I'm there, call them, we woke up. One of them is over here too, but those were the cousins I grew up with. They were not sisters, but we grew up as sisters. We slept in the same bed, lived in the same house. My mother always had a relative there living with us, or maybe one or two of them. But they hold us themselves in my age group. Many of them were in Monrovia, grew up in Monrovia, and I didn't go to it. You know, there was always the village there, regardless of what then you could turn to. You know, and so the village wasn't only hold us, but as you said, other people in the community, where you go and you would feel at home. People would look out for the children, you know, and discipline the kids too. So we're all disciplined by everyone out there. So we had to behave whenever we're around the older people or the adults. And we felt that, yes, we could go anywhere and feel welcome, anywhere. You know, Children's Day, Easter, where we had to do recitations and all that. And, you know, we used to compete who would say the best recitation. They would give us a prize and all. And so I knew how to crank. I could study and recite. But I still remember once when Phoebe Weeks took the first prize. I was always good for getting first prize, and to get up there and say the recitation. My mother used to teach me how to do the different gestures and all with my hands, and where to pause. And also, it will be like I'm telling a story. I remember this day, Phoebe Weeks got up to say her recitation for Easter. And there was a poem called The Creation. Oh my God, it was so good. It was so good. I mean, I still remember, because I started saying it at different programs after that, The Creation, and God stepped out on stage and he said, I'll make me a world or something. But she did it so well. Those are the things I remember growing up, you know, the competitive programs we had even in the church that made us want to be better. Children's Day, Easter, we all meet someplace, and after church, all that upriver food, all that hot liquor from the cabbage, the boiled cabbage and collard greens. So those are the memories that I remember, you know, that I've imprinted in my mind today. You know, I always tell people, I start off by saying, I'm a product of the public school system, you know. Liberia it wasn't all that bad. Liberia was not bad. I attended the public school in Crozierville. My mother was principal. Antoinette Tutman Community School was named after our first lady, Antoinette Tutman, and she was from Crozierville also. So I was in that school from 2nd grade to the 9th grade. Prior to that, I went to school in Arthington. I remember that because that was the period my mother was here in the States going to school. And when she came back, we moved to Crozierville. So from 2nd grade to 8th grade, really, I went to school in Crozierville. And when the school there stopped at the 8th grade, so it was elementary and middle school. When I got promoted to the 9th grade, I went to CWA. And I was there for 4 years, and I graduated from CWA. And then went to the University of Liberia, another public school. I mean, that was the government university for us. The other one was Cotton College. And the system, the school system, all the schools I went to, I guess, I mean, I gave credit for what I am today also. Although public school education, the education was good. At the university, I remember, I really didn't realize how great it was until I came to the States to do graduate school. I came for my master's. And I was able to get my master's in management within a year. And the program was good for 18 months. That was a commitment. So I decided, okay, I will do another major in finance. So under the same MBA program, I got 2 masters, one in management, one in finance, and then I went back home. But the interesting thing is when I was here, it was challenging for me because I had never studied so hard in my life. I go to a class, you got like 3 books to read for one class. Back home, I had to have 1 book to read. How am I going to do 3 books over here? But, you know, the perseverance and studying and the discipline and all, I was able to complete my master's, so, you know, MBA with two majors. It was at that time I realized how great the education system was. All of my credits from the University of Liberia were accepted here in the US, every single one of them. And I remember I had to do at the graduate level economics, micro and macroeconomics. Those were challenging subjects for me. They were kind of difficult at the University of Liberia. I aced both of them, but it wasn't easy. I mean, I know when I first started school at LU, I was very playful. It was my first time leaving home in my whole life. So I took that and put it on my head. I'm telling you, at the end of the first year, I was on probation. And then it was at the same time, at the end of that second semester, my father died. And that's when I got serious, you know, because I was like, wow, my mother has 5 children. I can no longer be a burden or take this thing lightly. So I started really studying. And even though I went on probation the first semester, I tried to recover the second semester of my freshman year. I was able to graduate from the university with honors. So I learned to study hard. And when I came over here, I saw those 2 economic courses and I'm like, I don't think I can do these courses over here again. So I went and I asked for the courses to be waived because I had done it at the undergraduate level. And the dean of this business college, he said, okay, bring me the course outline in the book. I gave it to him. And at the graduate level, those courses were waived that I took at the university because I took them down there. It was waived at the graduate level, but I had to do credits, you know, make up my credits to graduate. So I had to take other courses to make up those credits. But just the idea that all of my credits at the University of Liberia were accepted here, and some of them at the graduate level, made me realize how good the education system was there. And I am happy that I went to school in Liberia because it was so cheap to go to school there. It was so inexpensive relative to what we pay over here for education today. When I started earlier, I was paying $75 a year for tuition and $150 for dormitory fees for the whole year. And then later on, it was increased. You know, I remember students were demonstrating, increasing them by 100%, of course, you know, and they had a right to demonstrate because you're looking at tuition increased by 100%. But when I came over here, that's when I realized, oh my God, we had it so good there when you look at how much tuition is for in America. But we had a good education system. I'm a product of that, you know, government education. I know after I graduated and I went back to the university, I was working there before I came for my master's. I went back and worked at the University of Liberia. And I remember that once every 2 years, the vice president for academic affairs, John Carper, Tia Carper was his name, he used to make trips over here and made sure that the university was up to par, up to standard, so that students who left Liberia and went to school in the United States or anywhere, those credits were accepted and they would start, you know, their graduate work or doctorate work. So the school, my education, yes, was based on through the public school most of the time, except for high school when I went to CWA. And all of that is responsible. You know, I owe my success to the system, the education system in Liberia that I personally experienced, and I can only speak for myself. In Liberia, I remembered when I graduated from college, I was working with the Liberian News Agency because I used to do part-time job there throughout my college. I first started as a vacation student, and so every summer I used to work there. And then when I graduated from high school, I kept a part-time job because after a year, eventually my father died, so I started taking care of myself. So I used to work I had my money, my little pocket change there. I was also on scholarship because when my father died, my mother being the only person there, she had all of my brothers to support. I was able to get a scholarship from the Ministry of Education, and I was able to keep my grades up so that I remain on the list. I always tell people, every time when the registration started, I used to go to the Ministry of Education, sit there and wait for that list to be typewritten so I could take it and register. And I made sure I do it early because I wanted to get in the classes that I wanted to get in before they get too full. So every year I would be there. I would stay the whole day. I remember there was this fellow, Gerald Richards, I think he was in charge. I would sit outside his door and wait until he prepared that list. I would take that list and take it to LU, take it to the controller's office and, register. But when I graduated, I stopped. I got a job at the university in the personnel section. And this was 1981, I believe. Yes, 1981. Because of the riot, I think there was some rioting, race riot and all of that. We sort of missed one semester. We didn't go to school for one semester. So I completed my schooling mid-year and had to sit and wait until December to graduate. I worked at the university in the personnel office. And the thing that really struck me about the job, I started making $525 a month. That was a lot of money for me then. And that was more money than my mother, who had been a principal or a teacher all her life. My mother was still making less than $400 a month. And my first job out of college, I was making more than her. I couldn't get over that either. But I started there, and it was at the university that I heard about the scholarships. And I went to school, I was able to get a scholarship through the government of Liberia again to come over and do my master's. And after that, I went back home. I was supposed to work with the government for 2 years. I started working again at the University of Liberia. And in and out of the university, I worked there until the war started. I was teaching part-time there when the war started. But I also worked in my first husband's business. He had a furnishing business. So I worked there with him. And I taught part-time at the university. After the war started, I came to the States. I did odd jobs trying to get on my feet. And I think my first full-time job, I started with Blue Cross and Blue Shield in Washington, D.C. First as a secretary, and then as an assistant underwriter in training. And then, I was able to do my work based on my finance background in graduate school. And it was at the Blue Cross Blue Shield that I saw the job posted for the United Nations. And I'm looking at it, they wanted somebody in the insurance section in the UN. And they wanted somebody with client service experience. They wanted somebody who knew something about contracts and who knew, it's like I was reading through the job requirements. I'm like, this job seems like it was written for me. So I applied for it. And I applied for this job and I got the job. That blew me away because I didn't think anybody from the outside could get into the UN, because you talk about it as being, this place you would think you need somebody inside to get you hooked up. I got interviewed. I got flown into New York. I was living in Maryland at the time, working in DC. And somebody told me, there were over 100 applicants for this job. I said, well, when I read this job, I knew it was written for me. So I've been with the UN in the insurance sector since 2004. So, I tell people I should be retiring. I should really be retiring at the end of this month. But luckily for me, they increased the retirement age from 62 to 65. So I still feel young enough. So I'm going to hang in there until 65. The jobs I've held. And I'm reminded of some of the obstacles I've faced throughout my career. I did graduate work. I came to school and did my graduate work here in the U.S. I went back home, and the U.S. was never a place I wanted to stay. I always went back home because I figured I had my mother, my brothers, they were all back home. What am I doing over here? But when the war happened, I found myself back in the States. And one thing that really bothered me was the the doors were being shut in my face. And the excuse was, oh, you don't have any experience in the US. And after a while, it became, for me, it became kind of comical. I have the education, I can do the job. So how am I supposed to get the experience if you don't employ me? But I heard so much of that. And after some point, it became like, for me, I knew it, I accepted it, and I moved on. But things began to change. But even when they changed and you got doors open for you, there were other doors that were shut too when you wanted to, climb the corporate ladder. I must admit my days at the Blue Cross Blue Shield in DC, they were good days. I started as an administrative assistant. And there was a lady, Glennie Warby, I remember with the church this day in Maryland, and I wasn't even at church that day. I don't think I was well. But somebody called me and told me, Elma, so Glennie announced that there's this opening at this company in DC, but the branch is in Virginia. And I'm like, oh, okay, I will apply for the job. And she just made an announcement. Anybody think they qualify, apply for it. I said, okay. Before then, I had been doing a lot of temporary work. So I went, took the test, took the interview, and I got hired. Who else worked at the company? Glennie worked there. My cousin Comfort Goodrich Lawrence worked there. Comfort's sister-in-law Estelle Lawrence worked there. So I was the fourth Liberian woman to be hired at that company. So we're all working there. I worked there for 2 years, and people started leaving and finding different jobs, and moving out of state and all. And I was there with the company and they shut down. They actually closed that subsidiary down. And as God would have it, my section was, the only section that was absorbed at the Blue Cross headquarters in DC. And we're all looking for a job. I was pregnant at the time with my second child, and I went for this interview. And they didn't give me the job because I was pregnant. But interesting, and this came, basically the manager made that remark. I don't know who he made it to, and HR heard about it. And HR stepped in, and it was a big thing. But I didn't want any fuss because I was still there with the company. And I think what happened when he called me for the interview, my response was, okay, I need to warn you now that I'm 6 months pregnant. And his response was, well, we can't hire you. We want somebody who we can train. And that was the wrong thing to say. So I told him, Jara, and they had him, the scheduled interview, and I had to go to the interview. So I remember sitting down with another woman and asking her, I said, you know how difficult it is to find a nice professional outfit to come and sit for the interview, especially when I know you're not going to hire me. So I came to this States, to the United States with one child, even though I had her here in the States. I went back home. And when the war broke out, I came back, she was like 3.5 years old. I had other kids. I had 2 other girls, biological daughters. And I was fortunate to have my mom here with me. One, she was, as I always say, she was a disciplinarian, but a good mother. So I was here, and I didn't have the challenges of childcare that most other women had in this country, or have, I should say. Because my mother was there. My mother was my in-house babysitter for me. So I could go out there and do everything. And she helped me raise my children the way she raised me. I remember my daughter, the oldest one, learned to make up a bed when she was 4 years old. And my mom would step back and tell her, when you make up the bed, step back, make sure the bedspread is not hanging low on one side, not on the other side. I used to see her talk to my daughter about it. But one thing I knew, and looking at me, that discipline was necessary. Regardless of all the laws they have here against mothers disciplining their children, discipline is very important. Because I'm a strong believer in you spare the rod, you spoil the child. So I discipline my kids. They had the discipline, and it's funny sometimes because I'm like, yeah, sometimes some of them, and the older ones, different, but as the younger ones came, they became so challenging. So all of those responses, because I say so, no longer worked with the younger ones. I had to explain why. And I'm saying to myself, really? But at the same time, they knew very well if they did wrong, they would get disciplined. But I always tried to explain to them why. So, yes, they knew very well you go out, they better speak. Your cousin there, speak to people, do this, do that. So I brought them up with the kind of discipline my parents brought me. I remember now I can apologize sometimes for the things I did. Because my youngest always remind me how I beat her because this older person lied on her. She lied on me, Mommy, you believe her, you beat me, and she kept saying that thing. I finally had to apologize to her one day. Okay, I'm sorry, okay? I'm sorry I beat you when you didn't do it. You have to remember that there's no real playbook for being a parent. We all make mistakes, okay? But at least I can acknowledge my mistakes and I can apologize. But you're growing up, you become a parent too. There's no playbook out there. And the older ones look forward to it. Now the youngest one, she looks forward to traveling too. But before, she was the most difficult because my kids are like, they're 7 years apart. My eldest, I had her, and it was 7 years before I had the second one. And there's a 7-year time gap between the second and third. Then, especially the middle child, she loves to travel. Even the oldest one, she can't travel a lot now because she has kids. But they talk about wanting to go back home to stay. And I can see that happening, once, the country begins to pick up again and there's security and all that. But it planted this desire in their heart. And I tell a lot of my friends, and relatives, I say, listen, just take them there for the first time. Take them back for the first time. And take them back around the holidays, when you have things going on and they can go and they get to mingle with other kids who sometimes they're here in the States, they don't even realize the kids are from Liberia too, or they don't realize how many Liberian kids live here in the States, or how many children of Liberian descent live in the States. And that causes, that builds this community of Liberians over here for us. And for me, it's important because I say to my friends sometimes, we may not be the ones to get Liberia back on track, but it will be our children and their children. Once we take them back home and plant that seed, once they see where they come from and what is possible for a country. Because I tell my kids stories all the time about what Liberia used to be like. And I love the social media now because sometimes you see these clippings. This is Liberia I know. This is Liberia. You see Liberia had the first airline in Africa. We had Air Liberia way back then. I tell my kids also, I say, the University of Liberia had the best law school in Africa. We had the best medical college in Africa. Up until 1980, I remember. I was in the university at the time. We used to have kids from Nigeria, Sierra Leone, from North Africa. They were all there studying medicine at the AMWRT College of Medicine. Everyone that left that graduated is a doctor today, either in the States or other parts of the world. Took the exams, passed it, even in law school in Liberia. So Liberia was the first in so many things in the world, in Africa, I should say. So many things in Africa, Liberia was the first to do it. We may not get our country back there to that point, but I'm sure our children or their children can do it once we plant that seed, take them back home, let them see where they came from. I think we have work to do to remember them. What you're doing, I mean, this whole documentary, I think is a good way, it's a good start. But sometimes you see families die out, and that's the end of that story. That is the end of it. Liberia has done so much good, and all of that history is beginning to die down because nobody is doing anything about it. We have to continue to tell our stories through documentaries like this, so that people know that, and so that the children know that, you know, we have our own ancestry history back home. You know, I see these advertisement on television with, you know, ancestry and all of this person. Oh, I see where I get that drive from. My grandmother was this, my grandfather was. We have our own, and we have to work toward protecting our ancestry history and all that they did in Liberia. So I really admire and appreciate this documentary, because this is a step toward making sure we preserve that history. While we have the narrative, they said it's all about who has the mic. You have the platform, you put your narrative out there. Before somebody, as you said, before someone else comes and write it for you. And that won't be what it is. You know, there will always be the missing information and always be the narrative that they want out there. So we really have to begin to do more of that. You know, and Liberia in general, because when I think about the history in Liberia's role in civil rights, the people that we hosted, you know, Mandela, Mary McKeeba, and you know, Simone, those people that lived, that Liberia became a home to throughout this struggle. All of that is just dying away.